Thank you so much for having us. So I'm going to start off this conversation kind of setting up the story because this is something that I've been following for a few years now. And then Charmaine will get into the data analysis and also data visualization. And I am so excited to talk about this because I have been thinking about this investigation for 2 years. And so it's felt a lot like a pregnancy, and just seeing this out in the world makes me feel so happy and excited to share the extent of how this problem is affecting so many Chicagoans. So I want to start up with the framework for how we came to start working on this investigation. And Charmaine is going to help me change the slides because I'm a bit older and I have some tech issues sometimes. So I met Sylvia Taylor about 2 years ago. She contacted me and asked me to help her prove that the city was billing her unfairly for a vacant property. At the time, she owed about $20,000 and was in the process of trying to prove that the building was vacant, but she has an unmetered property, and she couldn't prove that there was no water. So in January of 2020, I actually went to her house and we walked around and she showed me all the water fixtures and I proved that there's no water. So I started my story by filing a few FOIAs. And so really understanding this system was very tied to how Sylvia experienced this system. So in the process of understanding what was happening to her, I was also mapping out this system that didn't make a lot of sense and had all of these different components of the story. So I want to show you how Sylvia came to me and reached out for help. Next slide, please. So back in 2018, I was working on an investigation looking at a very simple question, right? Are the cities that are closest to the Great Lakes, the largest supply of fresh water in the world, are they able to get access to affordable water? And so we looked at the cost of water for 5 cities along the Great Lakes region, including Chicago, Detroit, Duluth, Cleveland, Buffalo. And what we found is that there was, and over the last decade, there was an increase in the water rates. And we also wanted to understand access to water by looking at a very specific marker, and that was water shutoffs. So we were able to get water shutoffs for all of those cities, including Chicago. And so what you see here is how shutoffs played out in Chicago. And when that story aired in early 2019, Sylvia reached out, because she was having that same issues with both water shutoffs and then also delinquent water bills. And, after the story published, we had a really good opportunity to have a conversation with the 2 women that were running for mayor of the city of Chicago. Lori Lightfoot ended up winning, and she issued a moratorium on water shutoffs. And she also introduced a new program that was supposed to help people who couldn't afford the cost of water. So the utility billing relief program was supposed to be the fix to the issues that we highlighted in that first investigation. But if you go to the next slide, please. When we started looking specifically into what was happening in the entire system, I started seeing some really troubling trends. And so usually when I start working on these kinds of projects, I try to do what I call FOIA mapping. And that is this wish list of all the data that I want, all the documents that I want, and the different departments that could have access to those documents and data. And so I ended up filing over 30 FOIAs for this investigation across multiple city departments and the county. And you'll see some of the data mapping out with the water department, for example, the finance department, the Department of Administrative Hearings, and some of the issues that we came across initially was the fact that there is a provision in the FOIA law that says private information, including names and addresses, are exempt. So when I was going to the city asking for these large databases, I was very cognizant of the fact that they could not give me full addresses. So we ended up having to settle for a partial address. So that includes, in some instances, block number, the direction of the street name, and zip code +4. And then in some cases, I was able to get full addresses. But for the most part, the full addresses were very limited to specific things. So for example, the utility payments that were made from the consumers to the debt collectors, and then it went to the city. So there were very specific things. So we had to essentially piece together all of these databases to understand what was going on. It was understanding the delinquent accounts. It was understanding the metered, unmetered properties. It was understanding how those delinquent bills then converted into a violation that then had to be adjudicated through the administrative hearing process. And that became sort of challenging because we just didn't have something to link each case on. For example, my initial thought was, can I get a full database of delinquent accounts? And by delinquent accounts, I mean any account that where a person fell behind on their water bill for 60 to 90 days, which is how the city describes delinquent water bills, and then tie that through the system. So I wanted to understand what happened to each one of those delinquent accounts. We weren't able to do that because of those exemptions, but we were able to say specifically what was happening to the entire system as a whole. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So as part of our efforts to understand how this water debt crisis was impacting Chicagoans and which parts of the city were being impacted the most, and I knew that to be the case from my reporting around water shutoffs. And I was doing a lot of reporting on the ground. I met a lot of people who'd had a lot of water bills and huge amounts of debt, and I knew where they lived. And so in order for us to really understand what was going on in each community, we were able to get data from the US Census to understand the demographic dynamics of those places. We also use the vacancy database that's in the city data portal. And then we were also, so there was one question that kept coming up for me, and that was that when we looked at the administrative hearing data, we knew that the vast majority of people who ended up in that department got a default judgment. That meant that when the homeowner got a notice to appear in court, they did not show up. So they automatically got a default with attorney fees and administrative fees. So I wanted to understand, I wanted to say something significant about why aren't people showing up? And so the only way for me to do that was to do audience engagement. And with the help of my colleague, Kat, who unfortunately is not working with us anymore, we came up with a survey, and we spent quite a bit of time doing interviews with people who had water debt. If you can move it to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this survey was really designed to get at this question of whether or not people knew what this hearing was about. And so if you read that paragraph that was included in my story, that actually came from hours of volunteers going out to communities in the South Side and the West Side and doing interviews in both languages and reaching out to folks. We were able to get at the very least 100 responses. And it was a very tricky thing to do because the questions had to be broad enough for people to understand, but with some descriptors that would help me understand whether or not they knew what was going on with this hearing. So this is how we started the process. I wish I would have a lot more resources around audience engagement, because I wish we could have done a longer survey. I think it would have been really great, but it does require a lot of work. So I'm happy that we were able to do this part. If you want to go to the next slide, I also want to talk a little bit about the distribution model before I hand over things to my colleague, Charmaine. So it was really important for me, as someone who does this kind of reporting on a regular basis. I do stories about disparities, about racism, about the ways in which the segregated city plays out in different topics, including water. But with the understanding that our audience, the WBEZ audience, is majority white. And so it was really important for me to make sure that a story that came from community, because really this investigation came from community. I wanted to make sure that the same community that was being impacted by this had access to the information. And unfortunately, those communities don't necessarily consume news from WBEZ. So I came up with this distribution model, and I secured funding with the help of some colleagues. Now we're working, this is not the final postcard that we're going to be sending out, but it's fairly close. And so we're mailing out 18,000 of these postcards to residents who have been on a payment plan, either in 2021 or the last few months of 2020. So we know that it's going specifically to those folks who are experiencing water debt. And so as you can see, it has a direct link to the story in English. We're publishing the story in Spanish. I just finished copy editing this morning, and I can tell you that because I am bilingual, everything that I'm doing in this project is fully bilingual, including the audience engagement and the distribution model. And I'm so excited that we're doing this because, I have been dreaming about doing this kind of work for a long time. So I'm so excited that it's actually happening. So with that, my part of the presentation is completed. So I'm going to turn it over to Charmaine, who created the incredible data visualization that you see. I also want to give a shout out to Matt Kiefer, who was the data editor on this. And thanks to him and his work, I felt comfortable enough to focus on some of the other things I had to do, because this project was so big and it had so many moving parts. Having someone who I trust doing the analysis was really important. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charmaine.
Thanks, Maria. So I played a couple of different roles on this project, all of which were really fun, and I learned a lot. For context, I started working at BEZ in July, so I am fairly new, and I think maybe a month into my start, Maria called a meeting with me and Matt, and we got started. So Maria mentioned that she filed 30 something FOIAs. So how did we get all of that information into something coherent that we could analyze? We're talking like hundreds of millions of records, and not necessarily records that talk to each other, you know, especially if they're coming from different department databases. So how does this all work? Matt set up a database so that we could link records from different tables to each other and then conduct our analysis from there, because there was no way that we could, you know, sort of load all of that data as sort of separate files or CSVs and analyze them in memory. It just like, it would have never worked. So we had several group sessions where we sat down and really tried to understand, okay, like what data do we have? You know, what column from this table talks to that column in that table? And can we link them by addresses? As Maria said, you know, there are some tables where we just didn't have a complete address. I remember trying, while Matt was on vacation, I tried to match some tables based on just, I want to say like street name, street direction, and zip +4. And we had like a terrible match rate without sort of like that block number. It made a huge difference. So I also learned a lot in this process of how you get all these different kinds of tables and records to talk to each other when they don't necessarily come from one uniform database where everything is super clean and ready for you to analyze. So I just wanted to give, if folks are interested, just a quick look at the database structure, which is in our GitHub repository. I'm happy to share that if folks are interested, but Matt set up a bunch of migrations for a Django app database, essentially, where he loads the data, matches various models to each other. So if we have a record, or rather a table of records for properties, you match a property to a debt or vice versa. So I just wanted to let folks know that we do have a GitHub repository. If you're curious and want to take a look, please do so. But I was more involved with the data visualization and sort of the user experience on web and mobile. So I'm going to talk about that briefly next. I'm going to go back to sharing my whole screen. Okay, so BEZ does have a web presence, but we are mostly known for audio. And so for this project, you know, Maria really had this like grand, beautiful vision of something more creative, more flexible, something that drew people in, but also wasn't so overly complicated that people would just kind of scroll away immediately. So, you know, we wanted something more creative. We sketched out a bunch of ideas, both for the layout and the data visualization themselves. I do a lot of my sketch work on paper, and then I move them over to Figma, and then I build things out using tools like Flourish, where you can kind of throw in your data and you get sort of a plain data viz back out, and you can tweak it as you go. But we ended up building the whole thing from scratch, which was a lot of fun, and really, I think, like stretched our creative imaginations about what this could look like. And I collaborated a lot with our digital producer, who made some of these really beautiful graphics that became the chapter headings. So in case folks haven't seen, I'm gonna spend the last little bit of my time just looking at the build itself. So if you go to interactive.bez.org/waterdebt, this is what you should see. We just sort of have made the Spanish translation live. So I wanted to start folks off, because this was such a data intensive story, with the data itself, but to ground it in the context of a person, because that's really important, right? Like data is super helpful to sort of zoom out and see how this is a massive problem and give readers a sense of scale, but also to make sure that they understand that this is happening to real people. So we start with a person with Carla, and I created a scrolly telling sort of layout, because I believe that was a useful way to keep a reader engaged while looking at like lots of different data visualizations over the course of time. So I created a timeline. It's just a line chart of what happens to Carla's water bill and then also her balance. So you can just see over time, it really spikes after this water sewer tax is implemented. You can watch it grow. And then we sort of break out what the charges were. And we Maria found that Carla in particular was charged, about $1,700 in penalties. And then we zoom out, right? So that's Carla, one person. But across the city, there are $421.9 million in debt. You can see in the map where that's located. And then once you have a sense of like what the story is about, who the people are that are affected, you get into the story. So that was the idea behind the build. I'm happy to talk about the process, the sketching, but it is now 7:35. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to folks for questions.
All right, I'm sure there will be many. In fact, we already have quite a few written down. As a reminder for folks on the live stream, please add your questions right into the live chat on YouTube, and we'll be monitoring that and adding those to our queue of questions. So I'll go ahead and ask the first question, which is, there have been a lot of stories in the news about Chicago's south suburbs. Have you thought about extending your reporting into the suburbs of Chicago?
Yeah, the suburbs of Chicago are particularly difficult. So the city of Joliet just agreed to buy water from the city of Chicago. So their water supply is going to become unsustainable by 2030. And so as you're right, like there's a lot of suburbs that buy water in bulk, and they're different municipalities. And so it's, when I was working on the initial investigation back in 2018, I actually tried to get some data from some of those suburbs, and it just became too complicated. It is absolutely part of something that I would love to do in the future, particularly now with Joliet being incorporated into that water system. There's also plans to build a distribution sort of center around water. I still have to read more about that, but I think that water is one of those things that we are sitting right next to the Great Lakes, and it's a great supply of fresh water. But as climate change is real and it worsens, it's going to be really important for us to figure out who's going to have access to the most important resources, such as water. So that's the reason why I'm so adamant about covering these issues, because, I could have stopped the story after the moratorium on water shutoffs was turned off, but I actually continued reporting on the fact that there was a lot of people who were living during the worst pandemic that we've seen in modern history without water. And it really added some pressure to the city to try and find some solutions. And so I have gotten so many emails and phone calls of people asking me to help because they're in these like terrible situations. And that includes people from the suburbs. So it is something that I absolutely want to do, which is, I just have to figure out a way to make it happen.
Cool. I'm also reminded, we actually had a presentation at Chi Hack Night back in 2018 from some folks at the Chicago Tribune who did a story that you might remember called The Water Drain. And I think they did extend their reporting into the suburbs, but I just remember that was such a huge obstacle for them because the way in which, I think they were evaluating like water bills that folks had, and every municipality, every little suburb had a different way of calculating it, different time scale, different like units of measurement. And it was just like a huge ordeal just to even sort it out so you can make like that apples to apples comparison. So I'd imagine similar challenge for doing the suburb work for this project.
Okay, I can ask the next question here. So I Try to get the timing right here. Did you use census data from the 2010 census or the American Community Survey, which is more recent?
I believe we use the American Community Survey, ACS, the 2015 to 2019, because 2020 wasn't out yet. Yeah, those are the files that we used. We used the 5-year version.
Yeah, and it was really important for us to make sure that we were getting that data by zip code versus census tracts, because we got the data from the city with zip codes. And in some cases, we had zip code +4. So we had like a better understanding about what was happening in those communities. So yeah, that was the reason why we went with the American Community Survey data.
I can ask the next question. Can you share more about the FOIA mapping process that you described in your earlier slides? Is there a playbook or strategy you follow when putting together similar data requests? And just talk a little bit about like how you do that.
So there is no playbook for this. I have been doing this for a long time. And so FOIA mapping is just a thing that I do because my true beat is actually immigration. And if you know anything about covering immigration, FOIAs to the federal government are a dead end always. So I always have to think about what other department could have the information that I want. And so I'm always thinking about, okay, multiple sources, like multiple FOIAs in different places to see what comes through. For example, in this case, I wanted to understand what happened to each one of the cases after the default judgment in the administrative hearing process. And typically, some of those cases go into the court system in the municipal division. And so I went to Judge Evans and I asked for, as you know, the courts are not subject to FOIA, so you have to get permission from the judge, and then they sort of work on the data and then they give it to you. I'm still waiting for that data. So it's really important as you're working on a project to sort of understand, first of all, what form is behind each one of these things. So I'm doing a follow-up on this story, and I sent some questions to the finance department. They send me a link to a form that people have to fill out. And so then I filed a FOIA with each one of the fields for that form, right? So it's just really important for you to be really flexible when it comes to understanding what information you're trying to get, understanding the way that you request that information, where you request it, and also like this project, the reason why I was able to get so much data is because the FOIA officers were amazing. Like they were just excellent. Frank from the finance department was amazing. We kept going back to him and like asking, can we get, initially he just gave me zip codes for each one of the delinquent water bills. And I was like, can we get a street name, a block number? Can we add, like, he was just such a, like, so good to work with. We had conversations about the process. The FOIA officer for the administrative hearing department, he literally got on the phone with me and told me, I was like, can you please just read the fields in your database? And he just read them all. And I just took them all down and then I filed the FOIA. So I really want to stress that it is really important to reach out to the FOIA officer, to do your research, to understand the process so that you're not asking basic questions. Like, don't waste people's time, right? Like, make sure that you're doing your research, you know exactly what you're going to be asking, and then just be kind because they're just doing their job. right? And if you're pleasant to them, they're going to be pleasant to you, and they're much more willing to work with you and answer your questions and read you the fields in the database. Like, who does that? So I just want to make sure that people understand that, like, they're all human. So be nice.
That's awesome. I'm sure some FOIA officers are happy to hear that praise, because they probably don't hear it that much from my experience.
Okay, I'll ask the next question here. Can homeowners get a public defender for administrative hearings, court appointment? For an administrative hearing court appointment?
Yeah. So the way that the administrative hearing department was structured 20 years ago is that it's a quasi-government agency. And so it only deals with municipal violations. And in those instances, you do not need a lawyer to represent you. However, you can get one if you want to. The issue that I saw coming up during my reporting is that most of the people that showed up to these hearings didn't know what was going on. Okay, so I went to some of these hearings, and most of the people that I talked to there didn't even know that the lawyers representing the city were actually private lawyers that were showing up on behalf of the city, and that those lawyers were not sharing information with the residents that were showing up because they have an incentive to be more aggressive, right? They get to keep 25% of the money they collect. And so the administrative hearing process is sort of like the last step before the debt gets transferred to them. And so there was a number of concerns about due process in these administrative hearing process. People, if you have ever gotten a parking ticket and you have tried to get that thrown out, this is a department that you would show up. Okay, so these are lawyers who become administrative judges, and this was all designed to expedite the adjudication of violations that from the municipal code. So a long answer to say people can bring their lawyers, but they're not entitled to a public defender the same way that you would have it in like a criminal court setting, for example.
All right, I can ask the next one. So how often do you get to do the surveys like the one you did with the homeowners for the story? Is that something that you see happening more in journalism? And can you comment on how it changes the nature of your reporting?
I think that is happening more in journalism. I think that audience engagement is the future of journalism. Collaborations are the future of journalism. I think ProPublica does a really great job at incorporating audience engagement into their investigations. I certainly hope that this is the beginning of the same process for us at WBEZ. There's some announcements coming up around that I'm not sure that I can, speak on that. But I know for me, it was particularly important, specifically for this project, that I centered community in every step of the way, because the story came from community. And I wanted to make sure that those voices were included in the reporting at every step of the way. I have to give out a shout out to Charmaine. Like, when she started building the website, it was built for mobile. Now, if you look at the internet rates in places like Inglewood, in places like the South Side of Chicago, we know that those families do not have access to internet the same way that communities in the North Side have access to it, but they have a smartphone, right? So everything that we've done in this investigation has been with community in mind. And I'm really proud of that because when I started this project, I remember sort of talking about my vision and what I wanted to do. And I know that it's a lot and I know that it's different, but I'm really grateful that like people like stuck by me, even though they didn't understand what I was trying to do. And the audience engagement part in this particular case was really sort of proving that folks didn't understand what was going on, right? Like they were getting these letters from law firms, and I was having conversations with a lot of these folks, and they were like, I don't know what this is about. And so how could I include that in my reporting? And the easiest way that I thought about doing that is by having audience engagement. And I really do see that as becoming the next thing in investigative journalism.
Thank you. I think this is a good segue to the next question. But before I ask it, I'll just say I was really struck by how nice the mobile experience was as someone reading the story, and appreciated that aspect. This next question is, the bilingual aspect of your story is very exciting. Do you see more reporting happening in multiple languages? What are some of the barriers to doing this with more stories?
You know, it's difficult. It's very, very difficult because you got to understand, like, I was not only trying to get the information, reporting the story, telling the story in multiple formats, right? Audio and digital. I was thinking about distribution, which includes translations. And, you know, I was able to secure some funding for translations. It's, you know, it's always part of my process because, you know, I learned English when I was, you know, in middle school. So for me, language access is something really important. And so I always keep it in mind when I'm doing my work, but it just means that I have to do more work. So it's very difficult, not only because I have to make sure that we get the right translator, that we get the right copy editor, that we are not introducing any mistakes into the translation, and that we're using language that is for the audience that we're trying to reach. Meaning sometimes the translations use different, like really big words. And, you know, it's important for me to understand that, like, that's also an access issue, right? So that we're using language that is accessible to the population that's living in Chicago that only speaks Spanish. And then the other aspect of it too is like, you know, during the vaccine distribution process, we came up with WBEZ en Español. And the biggest challenge was, how do we tell people that this exists, right? And so that's also part of the distribution questions that I have to really think about, right? So like I have to reach out to Univision and go on their air, and I have to reach out to Telemundo. And for WBEZ en Español, during the vaccine distribution period earlier this year, we ended up having a bilingual program that was really well attended, and that was part of the distribution. So it just brings up a lot of other questions, and it just becomes really challenging because it's just about resources, right? Like, how do we make sure that we are translating the information that is needed, translated in a way that is understandable, and then also making sure that that community knows about us, because there is no relationship right now. So it can be really challenging when it comes to resources, but I think it's really important. It is something that I live with all the time. Like my mom doesn't speak English, so it's something that I think about often.
This next question is for Charmaine. Can you talk a little bit more about the open source data for your story? Is that something that's common with data reporting at WBEZ? And can you talk a little bit about how it's helped you do the work that you do, or what some of the benefits of having that be open source have been for you?
Yeah, wow. So for full disclosure, I did not do most of the work that's in that repository. That is all Matt Kiefer. I just got to witness his brilliance. But I would say that open sourcing our work is one, a matter of transparency. We want to be able to show our work to whoever is curious, because they have a right to know how we did our work. So I wanted to make sure that even if we couldn't, upload all of the data, right? Because there's just so much, and GitHub doesn't even allow that much data to exist on like a single repository, that at least we showed exactly what we did to all of our files. And then more generally, I would say, yeah, like open source is where I hope we go, where instead of working in like individual sort of spreadsheets that we send to each other via email, I'm hoping that like we work more on cloud and share URLs that we then, work with in notebooks that anyone can access. Like I'm a huge fan of observable notebook collaborative work, as well as like Google Colab, because we do so much stuff in Google Drive. But yeah, it's been a huge help to me, especially since I've gotten started. I've already like forked a bunch of repositories and tweaked them. So I'm a big fan of open source. And I hope that BZ continues to like move more of its reporting in that direction.
Cool. And it does look like there are other stories that are on GitHub as well. So is that becoming kind of like a more standard practice these days?
Yeah, I'm hoping that we're building out more of a data team. So I think, in the past, we just didn't necessarily have the staff to make sure all of our work was documented properly. Like even if we were doing our analysis and pushing it to GitHub, like we weren't necessarily adding readmes. We're like writing good commit messages to figure out like what's going on. So that's something for us to think about too. It's not just about showing our work for readers and our audience. It's also like showing our work to whoever comes after us so that they don't have to deal with like legacy breakdown stuff.
I want to share something that happened over the pandemic that I think is really important, and it gets to at the heart of where an organization like yours kind of meets with the work that we do. So again, in 2019, we published this big investigation, and we had a lot of data related to water shutoffs. And when the pandemic hit, the city didn't know who didn't have water. So there was a lot of people that did not get their water reconnected after the water moratorium was issued. And so there was a number of people who just didn't have water during the pandemic. As an institution, we decided to share our data with a number of organizations who we didn't have exact addresses because we couldn't get them, but we had water shutoffs with zip code +4. And so what those organizations were able to do is that they took that data and they started canvassing and started targeting blocks with a lot of water shutoffs. And they would send out these like postcards asking, if you don't have water, can you please contact us? We're working with the city to try to get the water reconnected, right? And so that's where I see the importance between, disclosing our work, yes, absolutely. But also, like, if other organizations want to use the data for other things, I mean, that's another possibility. And, we were able to provide something that the city didn't even have. And so we were really proud of that work.
All right, thank you. The next question is, can changes be made in the code that would make it more equitable? And how could technologies used in your reporting help?
I'm not sure I can answer that question because the way that the city's water department system is set up is so antiquated. I mean, the biggest thing right now, so I can't share this right now, but there's some issues around the fact that metered properties are charged less than unmetered properties. And for the most part, folks who don't have a meter in their property can't get one right now, unless they have a lot of money to replace the pipe between their home and the water main. because according to a Chicago Tribune investigation, homes that had a new water meter were leaching more lead into their water, right? So that's why the city stopped issuing those water meters. And so that's really the issue right now, right? That like the properties that are unmetered, they're just on average paying more for water. So how do you fix that without an actual like investment in infrastructure? And so I think that there are some problems that require more than technology. They actually require, a commitment to fix this problem. Yes, the water infrastructure bill that's currently in the Senate will be a way for us to get more money, but it's likely that it's not going to be enough. Water infrastructure has not been funded by the federal government since the 70s, right? Infrastructure money for water infrastructure has decreased by like 70% since the 70s, right? So that's the reason why a lot of municipalities have not kept up with a lot of those water infrastructure issues. And that's why you see the increase in the water rates to try to accommodate for some of those challenges. But right now, the city of Chicago has a big issue with water infrastructure. Specifically, how do you stop billing or overbilling people that don't have a water meter when you're not even able to install a water meter? So I'm not sure that answered the question around technology, but that's just kind of giving you a little bit of perspective about how big this problem really is.
I'll ask a follow-up here that's, I think, related. You spoke to it directly, which is there's a recognition that people of color, indigenous communities in particular, have historically had the least access to water in the United States. There's an infrastructure bill on the table now. How does your reporting fit in to the broader considerations going on in the country regarding access to water?
I think my reporting is just a tiny little thing because the water issues related to tribes specifically is a whole different story that I haven't even gotten into. I think that what I was trying to do is really kind of showcase that if we are having water issues in the city of Chicago that has access to this massive, lake, and if we are paying more for water on average than someone living in Phoenix, for example, then that's really like the scope of the problem. And so I didn't even get into water rights related to tribes. I didn't even start any of that stuff. But I do think that water is going to become the resource that everyone is fighting over. And I don't think that we're that far off. I think by 2030, maybe a little after that, we're really going to start seeing water as being a commodity that folks are going to have to buy. I'm a big fan of Octavia Butler. And so if you have read Parable of the Sower, you see how folks have to go out and buy water. And it becomes like a resource that is really, really expensive. I sort of see that happening if we don't necessarily like take this as a real issue to be dealt with.
Thank you. I think we actually are just a few minutes over, so I think we'll have to leave it there. But Maria and Charmaine, thank you so much for presenting and for answering all of our questions. And I think, will either of you be able to make it to the Zoom call after the live stream?
I won't be able to, but
Okay.
I hope that it goes really well and people can reach out to me on Twitter if they want to chat.
Same here. I'm happy to share my email. I've been getting a lot of really interesting emails about problems that folks are having. And so I'm trying to figure out what follow-ups I might be able to do.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you again, both. And I think it's time to transition to the civic hacking portion of the evening. So thank you again for joining us. And Cameron, you wanna send us off with our catchphrase?
With that, everyone have a good night and go forth and hack.